Have you ever wondered if someone could love you for who you truly are, stripped of your title, your bank account, and the power you wield over others? Kongde sat at the sticky corner booth of the Golden Griddle, his expensive Italian suit replaced by a faded, pilled sweater he bought at a thrift store specifically for these occasions. His hands, which usually signed multi-million-dollar contracts or gripped the hilt of a blade, were now tucked nervously into his lap. He looked like any other struggling man in the city, perhaps a little too tired, perhaps a little too quiet. Across from him sat a woman in a designer blouse who had spent the last 10 minutes looking at her watch and then at his scuffed shoes with an expression of growing disdain. This was the fifth blind date his well-meaning but overbearing aunt had set up this month, and Kongde knew exactly how it would end. He wasn't looking for a business partner or a social climber. He was looking for a soul that didn't see a price tag. The woman finally sighed, her voice sharp and impatient as she looked around the greasy diner. "I really don't think this is going to work, Kongde. My father expects me to marry someone with a bit more ambition. And frankly, this place smells like old fries." Kongde felt a familiar sting of cynicism, a coldness that usually settled in his chest when people showed their true colors. He nodded slowly, his face a mask of humble disappointment. "I understand," he said softly, his voice devoid of the command it usually carried. "I just thought the food here was honest." The woman didn't even wait for the check. She stood up, adjusted her bag, and walked out without a second glance, leaving him alone in the booth. He stared at the chipped Formica tabletop, wondering if he was destined to be alone because of the lie he chose to live. The bell above the door chimed, cutting through his thoughts. A young woman in a crisp white shirt and a long red apron moved through the aisles with a grace that seemed out of place in such a frantic environment. Her name tag read Imani, and as she approached his table, she didn't look at his faded sweater or his cheap watch with judgment. Instead, she offered a small, tired smile that reached her eyes, which were bright and observant. "Rough night?" she asked, her voice a warm melody that seemed to soothe the jagged edges of his frustration. She began clearing the untouched water glass from the woman who had just fled. Kongde looked up, caught off guard by the genuine kindness in her tone. "Is it that obvious?" he asked, a hint of a real smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Imani laughed softly, a sound like wind chimes. "Well, she didn't even stay for the pie, and our cherry pie is the only thing worth staying for in this neighborhood."
"I'm Imani."
Kongde felt a strange flutter in his chest, a sensation he hadn't felt in years.
"I'm Kangdae."
"I think I might need that pie now." Imani nodded, her dark skin glowing under the harsh fluorescent lights of the diner. "Coming right up, Kongde."
"Don't let it get to you."
Some people are so busy looking for gold that they forget how to appreciate the sunlight. She walked away to the kitchen, and for the first time in a long time, the powerful boss of the soul-based syndicate felt seen, not for what he had, but for the man sitting in a lonely booth. He watched her work, noticing how she checked on an elderly man in the corner and joked with the cook, her movements fluid and purposeful. She was a waitress in a red apron, and he was a king in a pauper's disguise. But in that moment, the distance between their worlds felt smaller than it ever had before. A week later, Kongde found himself back at the Golden Griddle, though he had no blind date scheduled. He told himself he just liked the coffee, but his heart knew the truth. He sat in the same booth, wearing a different but equally worn-out jacket. When Imani saw him, her face lit up, and she made her way over before he could even open the menu. "Back for more punishment, or just more pie?" she teased, pulling a pen from behind her ear. Kongde felt a warmth spread through him that had nothing to do with the heater humming by the door. "Maybe a bit of both," he replied, his eyes following the way she tucked a stray curl back under her headband. "You look busy tonight." Imani sighed, leaning against the booth for a brief second of rest. "It's the Friday rush. My shift ends in an hour, though. I'm just trying to make enough in tips to cover my sister's textbooks." Kongde felt a pang of guilt. He could buy the entire university with a change in his pocket, Yet he sat here pretending to be a man who struggled just like her. Tell me about your sister, he said, wanting to keep her talking, wanting to know the pieces of her life that made her so resilient. Imani's face softened as she spoke about her younger sister's dreams of becoming a doctor, of the long hours Imani worked to make sure she didn't have to take out loans. She spoke with such pride and love that Kangdae felt a deep sense of envy. He had spent his life building an empire of fear and respect, but he had never had anyone speak of him with that kind of pure, unselfish devotion. "You're a good sister, Imani," he said quietly. She looked at him, really looked at him, and for a second, the noise of the diner faded away. "And you're a good listener, Kangdae. Most people just want to talk about themselves. Why don't you wait until I'm off? I'll buy you a coffee at the park across the street. My treat." The park was cold, the winter air nipping at their noses, but as they walked along the winding path, Kangdae didn't feel the chill. Imani was wrapped in a coat that had seen better days, her hands cupped around a paper cup. They talked about everything and nothing, the way the city looked at night, the dreams they had when they were children, the things they feared. Kangdae found himself telling her things he had never told anyone, though he carefully omitted the details of his business. He spoke of his loneliness, of the pressure of expectations, and the feeling of being a ghost in his own life. Imani listened with an intensity that made him feel grounded. "You know," she said, stopping by a frozen fount, "my grandmother used to say that the strongest trees grow in the windiest places. You seem like you've survived a lot of storms, Kangdae." He looked at her, the moonlight reflecting in her eyes, and felt a sudden, desperate urge to tell her the truth. To tell her that he wasn't a struggling clerk, but a man who lived in a world of shadows and violence. But the fear held him back. The fear that if she knew who he really was, that light in her eyes would turn into the same fear he saw in everyone else's. "I'm just trying to find where I belong," he said instead, his voice thick with unspoken emotion. Imani reached out and touched his arm, her hand warm even through his jacket. "Maybe you're already there," she whispered. They stood in the silence of the park, two people from vastly different worlds, connected by a thread of vulnerability that felt stronger than any steel. When he finally dropped her off at the bus stop, he watched her until the bus disappeared from sight, his heart heavy with the weight of a secret and the growing realization that he was falling in love with a woman who didn't know his real name. As the weeks turned into months, their relationship deepened into something beautiful and terrifying for Kangdae. He began visiting the diner every day, sometimes just to see her smile from across the room. He learned that she loved old jazz, that she was allergic to lilies, and that she harbored a secret desire to travel to Seoul one day to see the palaces. He wanted to give her the world, but he was trapped in the character he had created. One evening, while they were sitting in a small, cramped booth after her shift, Imani noticed a small bruise on his jaw, a remnant from a confrontation with a rival gang that he hadn't been able to hide with makeup. "Kangdae, what happened?" she asked, her voice trembling with concern as she reached out to touch the mark. He flinched instinctively, a habit from a life of constant vigilance, and saw the flicker of hurt in her eyes. "It was nothing," he said quickly, trying to soften his tone. "Just a disagreement at work. My boss. He can be a difficult man." Imani's eyes filled with tears. "You shouldn't have to live like this, working for people who hurt you just to make ends meet. You're worth so much more than a paycheck that comes with bruises." Kangdae felt a sharp pain in his chest, a physical reaction to the lie. She was crying for a man who didn't exist, defending a version of him that was a shadow. "I'm okay, Imani, I promise," he said, taking her hands in his. Her hands were rough from work, but to him, they were the most precious things in the world. He realized then that the climax of his deception was approaching. He couldn't keep living this double life. He had to choose between the empire he had built and the woman who had taught him how to feel again. But as he looked at her, he realized he wasn't just afraid of her rejection. He was afraid of the danger his world would bring to her doorstep. The Mafia didn't just let people walk away, and they certainly didn't welcome outsiders with open arms. He was a man standing on a bridge that was burning at both ends, and for the first time in his life, the great Kongdae didn't have a plan. The tension within Kongdae's dual existence finally reached a breaking point when his two worlds collided in the most mundane of places. He was sitting in the golden griddle, nursing a cup of black coffee while waiting for Imani to finish her side work, when the door swung open with a violence that made the overhead bells scream. Two men in sharp, dark suits entered, men Kongdae recognized instantly as mid-level enforcers from his own organization. They didn't see him at first, tucked away in his usual shadowed corner, but they began harassing the cashier, demanding to know where the local protection money was. Imani stepped forward, her red apron a bold splash of color against the drab interior, her chin tucked high despite the visible trembling of her hands. "We don't have that kind of money here, and we don't pay for trouble we didn't ask for," she said, her voice remarkably steady. The taller man laughed, a cruel, metallic sound, and reached out to grab her shoulder. In an instant, this struggling clerk vanished. Kongdae was across the floor before anyone could blink, his hand clamping onto the enforcer's wrist with a grip that could crush bone. The man turned, ready to strike, but his face went ghostly pale the moment he locked eyes with Kongdae. "Boss?" he stammered, his knees buckling. The silence that followed was deafening. Imani looked from the terrified man to Kongdae, her eyes wide with a confusion that was rapidly turning into horror. Kongdae didn't break eye contact with his subordinate. "Get out," he whispered, a cold, lethal command that carried the weight of 1,000 deaths. "Leave this place and never come back. Do you understand?" The men scrambled out the door without a word, leaving the diner in a state of stunned paralysis. Kongdae stood in the center of the room, the power he usually wore like a second skin now feeling like a shroud. He slowly turned to face Imani, whose hand was pressed against her mouth, her eyes searching his face, as if looking for a stranger. "What did he call you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, thin and fragile. Kongdae felt the air leave his lungs. He reached out to her, but she took a sharp step back, the movement cutting him deeper than any blade ever could. "Imani, I can explain," he began, but the words felt hollow and pathetic. "The boss they were talking about. That's not who I am with you." She shook her head, tears finally spilling over. "You lie to me every single day. The sweater, the stories about your difficult boss, the way you looked at me like you were just a man trying to survive. It was all a game." She looked around the diner, at the cracked mugs and the peeling wallpaper, and then back at him, seeing the predator behind the prey for the first time. "You're the man people tell ghost stories about. You're the one who owns the shadows." Kongdae felt his heart tightening, a physical constriction that made it hard to speak. "I did it because I wanted to be loved for me, not for what I have. I wanted to know if a person like me could even deserve someone like you." Imani's expression hardened, a mask of grief and betrayal. "You didn't give me the choice to decide that for myself. You took my trust and turned it into a costume. Please, Kongdae, just leave. I don't know who you are, and I don't think I want to." Days turned into a blur of gray for Kongdae. He returned to his penthouse, to his silk sheets and his silent, bowing servants, but the luxury felt like a prison. He sat at his massive mahogany desk, staring at the city skyline, but all he could see was the red of Imani's apron and the light dying in her eyes. He tried to go back to his life, to the meetings and the cold calculations of power, but his heart wasn't in it. His advisors noticed the change, the way the Iron King seemed to be rusting from the inside out. He realized that the wealth he had spent his life accumulating was worthless if he couldn't share it with the one person who had seen his soul. He began to make changes quiet and radical. He started divesting from the more violent aspects of his business, funneling money into community programs, and ensuring the Golden Griddle would never have to worry about protection again, not through fear, but through legitimate ownership and support. He stayed away from the diner, respecting her wish for space, but he watched over her from a distance, ensuring she was safe. He sent anonymous donations to her sister's medical school fund, making sure the path was cleared for the family he had come to love. Yet, the hole in his chest remained. He knew that money couldn't buy forgiveness, and power couldn't command a heart to trust again. He spent hours writing letters he never sent, trying to find the words to bridge the chasm his deception had created. One rainy evening, nearly a month later, Kongdae found himself standing outside the Golden Griddle again. He wasn't wearing the pilled sweater or the expensive suit. He was wearing a simple, clean shirt and slacks, the middle ground of a man trying to find his true identity. He waited until the diner was nearly empty before walking in. Imani was behind the counter, her back to him as she wiped down the coffee machine. She didn't have to turn around to know it was him. She had memorized the rhythm of his footsteps over months of shared evenings. "I told you to stay away," she said, her voice tired but lacking the sharp edge of their last encounter. "I know," he said, standing at the counter, not sitting in their booth. "I didn't come here to ask for anything. I just wanted to give you this." He placed a small, worn ledger on the counter. It was a record of all the things he had done since they last spoke, the charities, the changes in his business, the proof that he was trying to be the man she thought he was. "I can't change where I came from, Imani, and I can't take back the lies. But I can change where I'm going. I'm leaving the organization. It's going to take time, and it won't be easy, but I want to be a man who earns his keep. Even if I never see you again, I wanted you to know that you changed me. You are the only real thing in my life, and I'm sorry I treated that reality like a secret." Imani didn't pick up the ledger. She looked at him, her eyes scanning his face for any sign of the boss, but all she saw was a man who looked older, humbler, and deeply, profoundly sad. She looked at the ledger, then at the empty booth where they had shared so many hours of conversation. "It wasn't just about the money or the power, Kongdae," she said softly, her voice wavering. "It was that I felt safe with you. And finding out you were the thing I was supposed to be afraid of. That's a hard thing to fix." Kongdae nodded, his chest aching. "I know. I'll be at the park tomorrow at sunset. I'll wait there every day until the first snow. If you can ever find it in you to talk to me as just Kongdae, I'll be there. If not, I'll understand." He turned and walked out into the rain, feeling more vulnerable than he ever had in a boardroom or a back alley. The next day, he sat on their bench, the cold air biting at his skin, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The park grew dark, and he was about to stand up and leave when he heard the crunch of leaves behind him. He turned to see Imani, wrapped in her old coat, holding 2 cups of steaming coffee. She didn't smile, but she sat down beside him, handing him a cup. The coffee was cheap and bitter, but as she leaned her head cautiously against his shoulder, Kongdae felt like he was finally home. They had a long way to go, and the shadows of his past would always linger, but for the first time, they were walking into the light together. Have you ever had to choose between your past and your future, or forgiven someone who broke your trust? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to like and share this story of redemption.